Howdy, folks. We are on week 5. Be short and sweet today, so pay attention. So, we're going to be looking at flowing lines. Okay, so this week's lesson.
Can you name the types of lines you used in previous works of art?
For our Spanish
¿Pueden
friends.
nombrar los tipos de líneas que usaron anteriormente en obras de arte?
All right. Our objectives for the day: to identify flowing lines in a work of art. If you want to create some artwork, you can use flowing lines to create a bamboo painting for extra credit. You should also be able to recognize the focus on nature in the works by Asian artists. Voila. So, lesson 5 introduces flowing lines. Flowing lines is what we're learning today. Artists use flowing lines to create a mood or a feeling. Okay, so look closely at the paintings on these pages while I talk. May, the artist, by the way, Gu Mei, used flowing lines in her landscape painting. Landscape painting is a picture of the land. And then the artist over there on the other side, Hokusai, Katsushika Hokusai, used repeated lines and concentrated on the contours of the objects in his portrait. Portrait, picture of a person. The lines are of various thickness. Boy with a Flute is a portrait, and both artists work directly on paper with ink. So here we have two types of Asian artwork, okay, and they're both two different styles.
Let's take a close look at the two works of art.
Vamos a observar detalladamente las dos obras de arte.
Look at the captions of the elements in the paintings, such as the writing in both and the features of the child in Boy with a Flute. What do the artist's works have in common? Discuss that in a little bit. Examine the objects with patterns, line patterns. How do you use lines to create emphasis in a work of art? What type of brush would you use to make the thinnest lines? Okay, so let's look at this. I'm going to present Gu Mei, 1619 to 1664. Well, let me make sure I'm pronouncing this correctly.
Gu Mei.
Gu Mei, okay. Was a musician, a poet, a painter of landscapes and orchids. You'll find that a lot of Asian art consists of, it's always like landscapes because it talks about like Zen and, Buddhism. And, this guy was a painter of landscapes and orchids flowers. Orchids and Rocks was created in 1644. It's a scene from nature. In the first and last sections of the painting, the orchid grows upward in a normal way. And the orchids in the middle section overhang a cliff. Orchids and Rocks is a landscape. So let's check it out. So I didn't realize these are in different sections. Sections. Okay. All right. So Chinese. Okay, so this is the difference between Chinese and Japanese art. This is Chinese art, and you get into like a lot of the Chinese restaurants. You will see, there'll be like a little mountain, and you'll see, a lot of this they call like sumi painting, and they use these brushes and these fine details, and that's the way they do their writing and stuff like that. But this is from the Ming Dynasty, which is a very famous period in China. Detailed of a hand scroll. So it's like a scroll, one of those things that rolls up. Hand scroll, ink on paper. Okay, so if you wanted to see this in person, it's actually housed at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. But it's very flowing. See the flowing lines? It's very smooth and flowing. Even the little twigs and stuff like that are flowing. Everything is done like real fast, but they're very flowing. Gives you a feeling of calmness. And then we look at Katsushika Hokusai, the contour lines on those. Katsushika Hokusai.
Katsushika Hokusai.
Okay, Katsushika. You can say it either way. 1760, 1849, most famously known for The Great Wave. Okay, he produced a vast number of prints, sketches, and paintings. He may have produced about 30,000 works of art over a period of 70 years. Hokusai is one of the main artists of the Edo period, and this is a different country, Japan. Okay, look that up on the map. Different people, different country, different language, different food, different art. Much of his work is done in a style called Yukio, meaning floating world. Okay, you probably see a lot of the influences now in some of the Japanimation that you see in the cartoons. This style focuses on nature and people doing everyday things. Hokusai's portrait reflects the transition from portrait of wealthy to scenes of common people. Boy with the Flute is an ink wash painting. Ink is used as if it were a watercolor. So here's the little boy, and it was like very lightly. You see the contour lines. He basically started out with the contour lines, the outline, and then went back in with a little bit of water and kind of maybe melted the lines a little bit and painted a little bit, just a little bit, so you could see the contours. Boy with the Flute. It's a very basic painting, but it's differently from this one. Okay. How are the lines used in the paintings? In Hokusai's picture, the folds in the fabrics and the strands of hair give a soft feeling and texture to the thin contours of the figure. And in May, the flowing lines of the orchids create a calm feeling. I told you that already. Okay. Are all the lines the same? No. In Hokusai's picture, you see repeated zigzag lines on the drums. Okay, and it's darker right here and lighter on the bottom. And then over here, you'll see smooth and broken lines in the orchids. You know, an orchid is a flower, um, smooth lines. How do you think the boy in Hokusai's painting is feeling? Let's see. The flowing lines of his body's casual pose creates a sense of happiness and peace, or thoughtfulness and quietness. He stopped moving his arms up and down. He just looks like he's relaxed. So it makes you think of it as being very peaceful. Okay? Dun dun dun. Using flowing lines. Now, this is what the quiz is and what this chapter is about. We know about our different types of lines. We talked about contour lines. Now we're talking about flowing lines. Flowing lines creates a feeling of calm and gracefulness. Flowing lines are fluid, which means they change direction and size. Think about water and fluidness. You can create light lines by adding more water to your watercolor paints, and dark lines by adding less water. The amount of water you mix with the paints will control the strength of your color. So if you're using flowing lines with a paintbrush, to create a thin line, you hold a brush vertically to the paper and touch the paper very lightly with just the tip of your brush, right? And then if you want to make a flowing line, you begin with a thin line and gradually add a little bit more pressure, and then you pull the brush up again to make the line become thinner. So that's like a flowing line. So you can experiment with different ways of using a
Can you paint
paintbrush.
flowing thick and thin lines?
Pueden pintar líneas corridas, gruesas y finas.
So if you were to practice with watercolor paints, and like if you don't have watercolor paints, that's okay. So when you have watercolor paints, remember I told you guys it's incorrect to paint the way that you guys are painting. Many of you guys have had these watercolor paints and you've been taught or you've been given the watercolor paints and not told the proper way to use them. Okay, watercolor paints is not used the same way that you use the tempera paint out of a bottle. Tempera paint is used to be dipped in like I want to say like honey mustard and ketchup. It's something that's like a chicken nugget sauce. It is like thick paint that you squeeze out and then you basically just paint it on with your brush, just like dip it in, paint it. With watercolor paints, it's a little different. It's lighter, okay? And that's why they call it watercolor. And what you do is you first, like I've taught you before, is you dip your brush in the water to wet it, and then you dip your brush in the paint very lightly. Use the point of your brush for thin lines. You should load it up with make sure it has lots of water. Wipe the excess off, and then gently push your brush down to make thicker lines, and then you can lift it up higher to make thinner lines. Also, if you want darker colors, you add a little bit more paint. less water. If you want to thin it out, you want to only use, you want to use a lot of water and not as much paint. So you practice using different amounts of pressure on your brush to make lines change just by the weight, how much pressure you apply to it. So here's an example, and you might see this a lot, of someone using flowing lines in their drawing. This is Shirley Paul, age 9. So she had like probably a big thick brush, like the big square brushes, and she dipped it in the water very lightly and made a line, and then she skipped it and pushed it a little harder to make it darker, and then went back, skipped over and made it again, and then dipped it in another color and overlapped it really dark, lifted it up, a little piece right here, and down and dragged it. And then they went back and used a skinny brush probably and just put little details and add the tiny little brushes on there. So it's like a little bamboo. You could try that. Now, if you were to do a painting, how would you draw a plant using a brush? So if you were to look at the piece of bamboo that was on here, or you could probably Google one, notice how it grows. You might even have these in your backyard. Bamboo is a plant that's very, very hard to get rid of, and it's something that grows very fast. So if you could, you probably could look up a Chinese brush painting on YouTube if you wanted to. You can see the way they do it. It's like, um, if I'm pretty sure if you watch some of these martial arts movies and some of these Japanese and Chinese movies, you've seen people doing little sumi paintings and Chinese brush painting hands positions, and you should pay attention to how they use their hand. They practice the brush strokes on paper, computer paper if you want to. Using the same black ink, paint several pieces of bamboo on white paper. Sit straight, hold your breath while making each brush stroke. Remember to breathe before each stroke. So that is something that you can try. Here's a little boy, and he actually has a bamboo plant, and he's just using black. We're not using any colors, just using black, and is holding his paintbrush like this, and then he's practicing by making the bamboo plant with light strokes and dark strokes and thin strokes. You could totally do that if you have paint at home. What happened? There you go. So describe the plant in your drawing. You should be prepared if I ever ask you to tell me what kind of lines you used. Were you successful in your drawing with your plant? If you were ever to do it again, what would you change? You are done for this lesson. So make sure that you take the quiz that has to do with this, and it's going to be asking you about what are flowing lines. It might ask you about what it is that we talked about. Try to take it while it's fresh on your mind, and any other things that you need to finish that up too. Have a great week.